It's open people are the ones that are interested in aesthetics. So, you know, there are lots of people who are, in some sense, blind to beauty. It's actually one of the things that distinguishes, strangely enough, it distinguishes conservatives and liberals, roughly speaking, because liberal people tend to be high in openness. They tend to be creative, but they're low in trait conscientiousness, so they're not very dutiful. They're not particularly orderly. They're not particularly industrious, not compared to conservatives.
Liberals?
Yes. Well, it's partly because, you see, this is one of the paradoxes. Conservatives are high in conscientiousness, especially orderliness, and they're low in openness. And I think the reason for that, in part, is that it's not that easy to be creative if you're too industrious or orderly. Because imagine you want to be a musician and you're 18, 19 years old, or worse, 25 years old, you know. Well, the thing is that it's an insane thing to do if you're someone who's dutiful and career-oriented and practical, because the probability that you're going to monetize your creativity is so low that it's futile to even attempt it in many situations. And so if you're too concerned with convention and productivity, then that's going to undercut your ability to manifest adherence to your creative vision, which also takes you in all sorts of directions, none of which are necessarily practical. So one of the ways of thinking about creativity is that it's a gambling strategy, and conservatives make low-risk, low-return but certain bets, really, and whereas the more liberal types and the more creative types, they make high-risk, high-return bets, and so almost all of them fail. But those who succeed dramatically, and they also change the world. And so, although it's very foolish to be creative, it's creative people who lead the vanguard forward into the unknown and transform the world. So, foolish as it is, it's absolutely necessary.
Foolish because risky?
Yes, because risky, yes. I mean, it's foolish in the same way that a high-risk, high-return bet is foolish. There's a high probability that you'll lose. And so if you're a conservative person, you're very concerned about hedging your bets. You don't want to lose. Being creative is a very bad game to play, but you won't play it anyways because you're conservative, so it isn't going to matter.
So you are an open late teen, and you have conservative parents, and you say, Mom, Dad, I think I've decided that I'm going to be an artist.
Oh yeah, and they think, what's wrong with that kid?
That's a complicated conversation, isn't it?
Yes. It's like discussing color with someone who's colorblind, and I mean that. And it's actually a perverse thing about conservatives in some sense, because the data on the economic utility of artists is really, really strong. I mean, artists and entrepreneurs are the same people, and of course, entrepreneurs are the people who provide all of the vision for the entire capitalist system. They're absolutely necessary. But conservatives tend to be so blind to art that they can't even see that the artists are the people who drive the economy forward. The funny thing about creative people versus conservative people, say, or liberal people versus conservative people, is that liberals start companies and conservatives run them. So, and I seriously mean that.
I'm glad to know you need conservatives.
Yeah.
I was getting a little bit worried.
They're managers. Like, conscientious people make good managers and good administrators. And they tend to do better in school, too, because diligence and dutifulness is an excellent predictor of academic performance. So if you want something that's already been invented, implemented, and then turned into a machine, you don't get someone creative to do that. They're off to do the next thing. They're not even interested in that. You'll bore them to death. So,
wow. So let's say you're an employer and you need some creative people.
Yep.
Is there a psychometric test to find out if someone's actually creative and they're going to be useful?
Well, IQ tests work. I mean, not everyone with a high IQ is creative. Lots of lawyers have high IQs and they tend not to be creative at all. Well, you think about why that is, Because lawyers are bound by precedent and rules, and so that isn't the same as being creative. And you want a creative accountant? No. Not really. not unless you're looking for a jail sentence. So
they don't like that word at all.
No. Yeah, that's right. My creative accountant, wink, wink. Right. So I mean, I psychometrically tested the 100 most creative lawyers in Canada as a project about 15 years ago with a magazine called L'Expert, which was a high prestige magazine among lawyers. And we had lawyers from across the country be nominated by their firms for creativity. And so we got some really, these were outstanding lawyers. And we tested them psychometrically, very, very high in intelligence. But not creative at all. The first trait was conscientious, dutiful, hardworking, diligent, industrious, orderly. Because, you're working 70 hours a week, and you better bloody well work if you're in a position like that, too. So it's nose to the grindstone stuff. Very low in neuroticism, because it's very stressful. So they didn't experience much negative emotion. Very disagreeable people. Well, they're litigators, and so they want to win. They're not compassionate, and they're not polite. And only after that were they open. So they weren't creative at all, but they were extraordinarily intelligent. So.
Do employers look for creative people?
No, not generally. Well, it's a real conundrum. So one of the things that's happening right now is that in most businesses, the non-creative people are increasingly being replaced by machines, right? Because anything that's creative can't really be turned into an algorithm that you can run as a machine, but anything that isn't creative can be. And so there's increasing demand in corporations for creative people, but the problem with being creative is that you're useless at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. Because at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, so a power hierarchy, you should do what you're told to do. You're not there to think outside the box. You're there to learn what you're supposed to do and implement it. And creative people are like, that isn't what they do. Now, what happens, though, to companies is that because they filter all the creative people out at the bottom, and then people start to rise up to the top, you really need creative people at the top because they are the entrepreneurial types, and they're the ones, for example, in law firms, even though lawyers aren't very creative, the more entrepreneurial ones are the ones that bring in all the business. There's, like, great lawyers who can implement, who can write well and communicate well they're not a dime a dozen, but they're relatively common. But the ones who are entrepreneurial, who can go out there and drum up new business, man, those people are hyper valuable, and they're very rare. But it's also very difficult to nurse them within any system, because systems do not nurture creativity. They're the antithesis of creativity. Because the artist is always the person who stands outside the structure. And so, or maybe builds his or her own structure, which is also why it's hard to evaluate creative people. You can't, really, because if they're operating within the confines of a system that has an evaluative structure, they're not creative. So they're a real pain to try to manage and to organize. But you can select them. You select people who are high in intelligence and high in openness. What kind of propels you up hierarchies of authority is intelligence and conscientiousness, right? And so then you might say, well, what about creativity? And it looks like creativity is, as you sort of know, is an out-of-the-box phenomena. And the problem is that if you're within a hierarchy, there's a ladder upward that you can climb rung by rung, and basically to do that, you have to do your damn job. Now you might say, yeah, well, isn't creativity, necessary? And the answer to that is absolutely, but it's not that useful when you're at the bottom, because who the hell wants to hear your damn creative ideas when you're just starting out? You're just a pain in the neck. Even if you're right, even if you're brilliant, you're just a pain in the neck if you're creative at the bottom, because you're coming up with all these radical ideas that are going to shake up the structure of the hierarchy. And plus, you haven't indicated your credibility. You haven't demonstrated your credibility to any great degree, so people are going to just write you off they're just going to write you off because it's easier than taking you seriously. Now, the funny thing is that as you climb up the hierarchy, creativity becomes increasingly necessary until when you're at the very top, it's absolutely vital. And many, many companies suffer from the fact that they, promote conscientious people continually up the ladder, and then they end up at the top with no creative people. But it's hard for the creative people to climb to the top, because creativity isn't one of those things that ratchets you up a hierarchy of competence. So they're efficient on the conscientious end and efficient on the intelligent end, but creativity is a whole different thing. I mean, partly because how the hell do you evaluate a creative person? You can't, by definition, because to have a structure of evaluation means that something has to be done in a tried and true and measurable manner, and that isn't what a creative person does. Like they make a left turn, a 90-degree turn, and they say, well, I'm going to do it completely differently. It's like, well, how is someone going to evaluate you if you do that? Now, you might be right, and creative people are often wrong, but sometimes and vitally dead right when no one else is. But it's really problematic. I mean, if you're a creative person, your best bet, I would say, is to discipline yourself and ground yourself in something relatively practical that will enable you to eke out some sort of living. and then to practice your creative endeavor on the side. You can head headlong into it and try to make money and be creative at the same time, but I'll tell you, man, my experience has taught me, and this is a lot of experience and a lot of watching, and it's not something I'm happy to say, is that it's very, 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 very difficult for creative people to monetize their creativity, and most of the time it's an exercise in futility. So what you have to do is stabilize yourself in some sort of productive and traditional domain, and then use your extra time to work creatively and see if you can branch out that way.